Well, this next story is one that I would have thought would be getting wall to wall coverage, headlines absolutely everywhere. But in fact, outside of some very good coverage by The Australian and a little bit by Sky News, I really haven't seen much on this story at all. And that surprises me. And thankfully, we have Senator Matt Canavan here to bring us up to speed. Senator, how are you?
Good day for yourself, mate.
Doing very, very well. I'm talking about this extraordinary ruling by an Australian judge, absolutely scathing of the publicly funded Environmental Defenders Office. For those that don't know anything about this story, what are we talking about?
Well, look, it might be too late for the summer reading list, but if you are looking for a cracking read, you should turn to the 290-page judgment from Natalie Charlesworth on this Santos gas project near the Tiwi Islands. The Tiwi Islands are just off the coast of Darwin, and this project has been held up because I mean, not all, but some of the Tiwi Islander Indigenous peoples had claimed that this pipeline would disrupt some of their cultural heritage, and in particular, some of their song lines. And so there's an extraordinary story, actually more extraordinary than the dreaming, it's the stories themselves, where some activist green protesters effectively infiltrate this group. The judge finds that some of those green activists had lied to the Tiwi Islander people, had manipulated evidence that was presented before the court to suggest that these dreaming stories would interfere, would be interfered by the Santos gas pipeline. So they're effectively lying to not just Indigenous people, but to the court. And as you say, this hasn't really been covered. And this group, this Environmental Defender Office group that was involved in taking this action, they get government funding. They get funded by taxpayers, and have been found to have been manipulating evidence before the federal court. You got to wonder, why should they continue to receive government funding after being found to conduct in this kind of behaviour? The reality is, Topher, that this is a sweetheart backroom deal between the Labor Party and these green activist groups, not just the Environmental Defenders Office, there's others as well, that receive your money, your taxpayer dollars, to run around the country, divide Indigenous communities, stop economic projects that would deliver tax revenues to the Australian people. And then the kickback for the Labor Party is they get green preferences and it helps them get into Parliament. It is a terrible, sordid tale that more Australians should know about.
Well, you mentioned not a lot of coverage, but one exception to the fact that you're right, there hasn't been a lot of coverage, but one exception has been The Australian. There's an article here, Green Defenders overreach themselves in the Tiwi Islands. I won't read the entire thing, but I recommend, well, I will put the link in the description of this video. I recommend people go and have a look. But it was actually found by the judge that, and I'm quoting from the very end here, she wrote, "He did not lie to the court," she said, "but he lied to the islanders." This is in reference to a researcher who was using essentially doctored maps to try and get islanders to tell him what was suitable to him rather than tell him what was actually true. This appears to be activist legal, what do you call it, lawfare at its worst.
Oh, it absolutely isn't. Most Australians would be familiar with the Crocodile Dundee story, but there's a more fantastical story here in terms of what the Tiwi Islanders call Crocodile Man. They believe that there was a man who wouldn't share his land, and in the story he was speared by the local tribe and ended up having to crawl out to the ocean with spears in his back, and he became known as the Crocodile Man after that story. And it's presumably a story about needing to share your resources with the community. It's a lesson-based tale. And anyway, this apparently occurred near a place called Cape Forecry. And what this particular environmental lawyer did, who was working for the EDO, he presented maps to the Tiwi Islanders, which seemed to suggest and prompted them to say that this Crocodile Man had actually travelled many kilometres offshore and therefore potentially near or around the Santos gas pipeline. The judge found that those maps were completely, as you say, doctored or not a truthful characterisation of what the land looked like in those times. In fact, the Tiwi Islands wouldn't even have existed at this time. And so that kind of behaviour and conduct, it's got to be called out. I mean, as I say, this divides these communities. You can tell from the court transcripts that this local Tiwi Islander Indigenous group have been completely divided because there are some people who support the pipeline. There are some against, and that's fine. It's a free country. You can be against these types of projects. What is reprehensible behaviour is for lawyers from outside those communities, government-funded environmental activist groups, to come in and manipulate and lie to those local communities to increase division, stop projects in this way and interfere with a political process, a local process, which should be left to the local people to work out with these major companies. They should consult with these groups. No one's saying they shouldn't. They should take into account these factors, but they should do so without the interference of these environmental activist groups that are pursuing a political agenda funded by your taxpayer resources.
One of the things that strikes me about this story is the contrast in the media reaction to this decision versus 2022, when initially the Environmental Defenders Office did have a win. Santos lost. Here, in fact, is a 2022 ABC story covering exactly that. What do you make of the relative silence from the media on this latest? It's an 8-day-old story. There's been plenty of time. Why aren't they talking about it?
Well, the shame is that some sections of our media are in bed with those environmental activists. We've seen from other stories, the ABC, for example, have covered that they often work in cahoots with these environmental groups. We saw that shocking incident last year where ABC journalists were working with an environmental activist group to effectively trespass and go and doorstop a CEO at their home, their own home. Our media class think of themselves as part of the political process, not the news gathering process, and that's why there's silence on this story, which is very embarrassing for some of the parties that many in the media support. And look, that's why it's so important for shows like yourself to be shared and pushed through, because we don't need to rely on the fake news that comes out of our mainstream media anymore. There's other ways of getting this news. You can go to the federal court website, and as I say, read this transcript for yourself. It's long, but the major parts of it are only 10 or so pages. And as I say, it is shocking, and you'll learn a lot more than you will from picking up most of the Australia's papers or listening to most of Australia's TV and radio broadcasts.
Sadly true. Now, just last question, Senator. You mentioned earlier whether the funding should continue for the Environmental Defenders Office. Senator Jonathan Duniam, the Shadow Environmental Minister, has made calls for the Environmental Defenders Office to be defunded. That's all well and good, but to me doesn't seem to go nearly far enough. This surely must rise, and I'm not a lawyer and neither are you, and we're not trying to express a legal opinion here, but I've certainly got questions about white-collar crime, about fraud, about the office itself gaining financial advantage by deception. There must surely be the ability to put the shoe on the other foot and actually begin an investigation into their conduct.
Well, look, that's a very good point, Topher, and I do think they should be defunded. There have been calls already for this particular lawyers that we've been talking about, his registration to be looked at. There's also calls for some researchers at the University of Western Australia to whether they should have continuing academic employment given the conduct they have. I mean, this kind of behaviour does, of course, then cause a pall over all of these professions, lawyers and academics, and unless those institutions, unless those the governing bodies of those professional organisations take action. If action is not taken when this kind of conduct is exposed, then all of us lose trust in those institutions. Now, in terms of whether other crimes have been pursued, it's certainly something myself and I'm sure other senators will be taking up in the Parliament when we return about whether or not this kind of conduct does fall foul of criminal laws. As you say, there's certainly a lot of smoke here, a lot of questions that should be asked. And while not much of the media is covering this, as you say, I don't think this issue is going away, and many of us will be pursuing this when Canberra returns in a couple of weeks.
Well, that's wonderful news, Senator, and I wish you Godspeed as you pursue getting to the bottom of this and making sure that the appropriate consequences are faced by those responsible. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Aussie Wire.
Thanks very much, Tova.